I run a YouTube channel where I discuss philosophical subjects, sometimes through my own life experiences, by analyzing my own thought process. Recently, a viewer criticized me for sharing a thought process without citing the greats like Marx, Aristotle, and so on, philosophers. Basically, they told me I sounded like an undergrad because I spoke from my own experience instead of a textbook. Now, I make videos about deep topics, so I knew eventually I'd attract the type of person who thinks philosophy belongs in a museum, not in real life. It's still a very small channel, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the intellectual gatekeepers arrived. That's what I call these people. I want to talk about this mindset, right? Because I strongly disagree with it. And I think this is partially the reason many people have no interest in philosophical stuff because of this attitude coming from people who act like you need a degree in philosophy just to have a valid thought. So basically, this person has read a lot of books on philosophy or studied, I don't know. Now, I have never studied philosophy. I only majored in science back then. But the person implied that whatever I was talking about was already discussed way deeper by great philosophers. So maybe I should do some research before I open my mouth. Like I said, I think a lot of people do think this way. And honestly, when it comes to scientific subjects, I would actually agree. We really don't lack people who pretend to be experts and spill nonsense, right? Just look at the vaccine situation, for example. If I came on here and started talking about quantum entanglement or giving medical advice based purely on my experience or thought process, I should absolutely be criticized. And I clearly need to shut up, right? In science, there's a right and wrong answer. You need the data, right? You need the research. You can't just feel your way through an engineering problem. If you do, the bridge will collapse, right? Not to mention in science, inconclusive is actually a valid conclusion, right? Real scientists are trained to admit when the data isn't there. They're okay with uncertainty, right? They're not going to force a certain answer based on feelings. Now, philosophy, at least the way I view it, it's not always about defining objective facts, right? We're not debating tax brackets or election results here. Those things require hard data. It's also not just about memorizing every concept in a textbook. It's about examining the human experience. And to do that, especially with your own experience, you do need to think for yourself. You can't expect all the philosophers laying out your life experience and doing the thinking and realization for you, right? In the end, the purpose of philosophy is to provide you with concepts, vocabulary, and frameworks. These are tools that assist you in the process of your own thinking. You should be using their ideas as a lens to help you examine your own reality. If you just treat their words as the final answer, then you're not really thinking. You're just memorizing. When we talk about things like loneliness, purpose, or suffering, we're not trying to discover a new particle. We're trying to describe what it feels like to exist. Right? The problem is, if we treat doing the research as a prerequisite for sharing a human experience, we end up discouraging the conversation entirely. Right? And surely it can't be beneficial to use philosophy expertise to filter out who is qualified to speak on these subjects. You know what I think this is? It's the same old hierarchical thinking again. It's the idea that insight is something that trickles down from the top. At the top, you have the great minds, right? The academics, the authors, experts who have been approved, right? They create concepts. And then there's the rest of us down here. Our job, apparently, is just to consume their ideas and cite them correctly. If you try to bypass that structure, if you try to generate your own meaning directly from your own life, you get labeled as naive or undergrad because you didn't pay your dues to the hierarchy first. And honestly, don't we have enough hierarchy in our society already? You look around and you see people pushing for a more extreme version of social hierarchy right now. Right? You see the rhetoric trying to push immigrants at the bottom, just so the rest can feel like they're going up the social ladder, right? You have the rampant classism. Now, are we supposed to play this hierarchical mind game with philosophy too? Right? That would be the ultimate death of thinking, right? I don't know. I feel it turns knowledge into a status game. It becomes more about whether you have the credential to say it. Again, we're not talking about scientific facts here. Right? That's where the credentials, expertise, all that stuff really matter and should be respected. We often draw a sharp line, between academic philosophy and life philosophy. The former is viewed as this rigorous profession, right? Logic, citation, peer review, all that stuff, while the other is often dismissed as personal wisdom or a coping mechanism. We're told that one belongs in the ivory tower and the other belongs in the streets, or whatever the saying goes. What about Dostoevsky, right? He was not an academic. He was a man who derived his worldview not from textbooks, but from the trauma of standing in the execution line and spending years in a Siberian prison camp. That was an exceptionally hard life, right? His philosophy wasn't an intellectual game. It was for survival. If we accept him as a philosopher, then we have to admit that deep philosophical insight also comes from life, not just the classroom. If we take the logic further and take a look at our current times, we can see where the true philosophy actually lives. I remember watching the documentary about the woman from a village in South Sudan. She had survived multiple sexual assaults by different groups and the devastation of war. Yet, despite this unimaginable suffering, she wakes up every day, helps other women in her community, and maintains a pretty positive, constructive outlook on existence. She found her meaning and will to carry on, right? If I were to ask her about the meaning of life, she would likely offer a profound, battle-tested philosophy of resilience. Now, imagine an academic philosopher stepping in to interrupt her. Imagine him asking, well, that is a nice sentiment, right? But have you read Aristotle? What is your citation for this claim? How do you logically define the concept hope in the face of suffering? Right? That would be absurd. Right, to tell this woman she needs to read Aristotle before she shares her wisdom is not just arrogant, it's intellectually dishonest. But you might say, well, is what she has really philosophy or is it just, folk wisdom? But the word philosophy literally translates from the Greek as the love of wisdom. It does not mean the love of academic jargon. You might want to get into that whole thing of explicit philosophy, implicit philosophy. Yes, of course, right? But the fact that she wakes up helping others despite the extreme hardships life throws at her proves she has an internal logical system. Not only that, she seems to have a very strict moral code. Like I mentioned in my other videos, how you should develop your own moral code and respect that code. To me, she already did that, right? Does her folk wisdom or whatever not cover the subject of moral reasoning, meaning and purpose, and suffering and resilience? She has decided that life, despite its horror, is worth sustaining. She possesses an ethic, right? She has decided that the correct response to suffering is to help others, not to destroy them. You tell me that's not philosophy with logical reasoning, subjects of moral and ethics? Of course it is. Her action already shown that, right? Just because she hasn't written those things down in a fancy document doesn't mean they don't exist. But I guess she should just shut up because she can't quote Aristotle, right? So do we seriously think we can't have a deeply interesting philosophical conversation with a person who has never read a book? Of course we can. That's not how it works, right? A father from a remote Chinese village who doesn't know how to read, but somehow fully accepts his trans son with unconditional love, even when everyone else in the village frowns upon him, right? You don't think you can have an interesting conversation with this person? You don't think he has a philosophy on love, identity, and family dynamics? I'm sorry, but that's not how the real world works. There's a lot of deep, profound philosophical thinking in this world that has never been heard or written down. And let's be honest, right? This is exactly what the great philosophers didn't want. They didn't want their knowledge to be used as a silencer for conversations. Socrates never worked in a university, right? He spent his entire life in the agora, the public marketplace, talking to shoemakers, politicians, and soldiers, farmers. He believed wisdom was found in dialogue with everyday citizens, not in books. He asked questions in the street. A lot of great thinkers talk to common people to understand better. So let's not play this game. So to be honest, I'm reading A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell right now. I could easily come on here, make videos reciting what I read, and position myself as neutral educator, right? I would explain one concept at a time, acting as a simple messenger for, other philosophers. That way, I would also be able to pump out way more contents, right? If I did that, I'd probably be attacked less in my comment section. Why? Because I would be neutral. I would be safe, right? No one attacks the librarian for reading the title of a book, right? She's just explaining what's already there, they would say, right? She's just reciting. Now, I would probably be more popular right now, right? I certainly wouldn't be getting threats and insults, right? But the price of that safety is hiding, right? It would mean using academic concepts as a shield, so I never have to share what I really think. Now, it would mean staying, friendly and neutral just to avoid judgment. But I'm not here to please the academics or the algorithm. I'm not here to hide behind the safety of citation. So I will talk about whatever I want. Also, logically, let's look at the numbers, right? There are billions of us. We share thousands of years of human history. Of course, many people are going to reach similar conclusions. If a woman in South Sudan comes to the same realization as a man in ancient Greece, it's not because she needs to cite him, right? It's because they're both looking at the same reality, right? They're both staring at the same human condition. The suffering, the joy, the struggle to survive, meaning, purpose, why we should keep on living. I am fully aware of that. I probably won't be saying anything new, right? But that doesn't mean the thought process doesn't matter. If you say suffering can lead to growth out of your own life experience, not from reading philosophy, it doesn't mean your thought is redundant, right? Nietzsche said the same thing 150 years ago. It just means you both walked a similar path. One is not necessarily more valid than the other.